Kang Tae-jin was Seoul's most feared crime boss, a cold, calculating, untouchable. When his wife was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer, he didn't hold her hand. He placed divorce papers on the marble table and walked away. Then he did something far worse. He made sure she got sick in the first place. This is the story of a woman who was supposed to die quietly, and the moment she refused. If this story grips you, hit like, drop your city in the comments, and let me see how far this reaches. Now stay with me, because this one will shake you to the core. The penthouse sat on the 43rd floor of a glass tower above the Han River, and from up there on clear evenings, Seoul looked almost peaceful, lights scattered across the basin like something deliberate, something arranged. Nia Brooks had always found that view beautiful. In the early years, she used to stand at the floor-to-ceiling windows with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, watching the river catch the last of the daylight, and she would think, against all logic, against everything she had seen in refugee camps and disaster zones across 3 continents, that maybe she had finally found the place where things held together. She was wrong, but she didn't know that yet. Nia was 35 years old and had spent the decade before her marriage working for international humanitarian organizations in South Sudan, Bangladesh, and the Philippines. She had distributed food during floods, registered displaced families in tent cities, and sat with women who had lost everything and somehow kept moving. She was not soft. She had never been soft. But she was the kind of woman who believed, stubbornly, sometimes foolishly, that people were capable of more than their worst instincts. That belief is what got her into trouble. She had met Kang Tae-jin at a charity fundraiser in Seoul 7 years into her posting there. He had walked into that room the way men who own things walk into rooms. Unhurried, scanning without appearing to scan, occupying space without taking up too much of it. He was 40 at the time, lean in a way that suggested discipline rather than genetics, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from something harder than bone. He had introduced himself as an investment director. She had believed him because he was very good at being believed. What she didn't know, what she wouldn't fully understand until much later, was that Kang Tae-jin's legitimate businesses were a shell built around something older and far more dangerous. His real empire lived in the spaces between legality, in the payments that passed through untraceable accounts, in the fear that kept rival organizations from testing his borders. He ran one of the most organized criminal syndicates in South Korea with the same quiet efficiency that other men ran shipping companies. He had never been arrested. He had never even been seriously investigated. He was not the kind of man who made mistakes. Nia should have been a mistake. She was foreign, outspoken, emotionally direct in ways that Korean high society found difficult to categorize. She asked questions at dinner parties that made men in suits go quiet. She laughed too loudly. She sent money every month to a women's shelter in Nairobi that she had helped establish years before. She was, in almost every way, the opposite of what a man in Tae-jin's position should want standing beside him. He married her anyway. And for 4 years, genuinely, not in the way that powerful men sometimes perform contentment for their social circle, but genuinely, it seemed to work. She did not ask too many questions about the parts of his business that operated in shadow. He did not try to flatten her into something more convenient. They lived in the penthouse above the Han River. They traveled, they argued about small things and occasionally about large ones, and she told herself that the version of him she knew was the real one. The morning everything changed began like any other. Nia woke at 6:15, which was her habit. Tae-jin was already up, also his habit. She showered, dressed, and found him in the kitchen, standing at the counter with an espresso cup, reading something on his phone. He did not look up when she came in. That was also, increasingly, his habit. She had noticed a lump in her left breast 3 weeks earlier. Her GP had referred her immediately to Seongbuk General Hospital's oncology department. The biopsy had taken place on a Tuesday. She had not told Tae-jin about any of it, partly because she was not yet certain there was anything to tell, and partly, though she had not admitted this to herself until later, because she had already begun to sense, with the low animal awareness that bodies develop before minds catch up, that something in her marriage had shifted in a way she could not name. The results came on a Thursday. Dr. Han Seo-yeon was 41, direct, and had the particular manner of oncologists who have delivered this kind of news so many times that they have learned to do it without performing grief on the patient's behalf. She set the folder on the desk between them, folded her hands, and told Nia that the biopsy had returned a malignant result. Stage 3 breast cancer, aggressive cell type. Treatment would need to begin immediately. Nia sat with that for a long moment. The fluorescent light above the desk buzzed faintly. Somewhere down the hall, someone was moving a cart with a squeaky wheel. She asked how long. Dr. Hahn said that with aggressive treatment, chemotherapy, followed by surgery, followed by radiation, the 5-year survival rate was approximately 60%. Without treatment, the disease would progress rapidly. Nia drove herself home. She sat in the parking garage of the tower for 11 minutes before she got out of the car. She did not cry. She had learned in the field that certain kinds of shock don't produce tears immediately. They produce silence and a strange, heightened clarity where you notice things you normally filter out. The oil stain on the concrete beside her front tire, the distant sound of a delivery truck reversing somewhere above ground, the way her own breathing sounded slightly too loud inside the car. Then she went upstairs and told her husband. Tejan listened. He stood by the window, the one with the river view she had always loved, his espresso cup still in his hand, even though it must have gone cold an hour ago. He didn't pace. He didn't reach for her. He stood perfectly still the way he stood when he was calculating something, and she watched his face and understood, with a clarity that was almost physically painful, that he was not processing grief. He was processing a problem. She asked him what he was thinking. He set the cup down on the window ledge and told her he needed a few days. She said she didn't understand what that meant. He said it meant he needed a few days. That night he slept in the guest room. The next morning he left the apartment before she woke. He came back that evening and sat across from her at the dining table. The marble table she had always hated because it was too cold and too large for 2 people, and he set a folder of documents on the surface between them. She looked at the folder. She did not touch it. He told her that he had thought about it carefully and that he had made a decision. His organization operated on the perception of strength. Weakness invited challenges. A prolonged illness. The public deterioration that came with aggressive chemotherapy, the uncertainty, the medical appointments, the possibility that she might not survive, would send a signal to people who were always watching for exactly that kind of signal. He could not afford that. He would not. She said very quietly that she was his wife. He said he was aware of that. She said she had cancer. He said he was aware of that too. The folder contained divorce papers, a property settlement agreement, and documentation for the transfer of a villa in Mapogu into her name. The settlement was generous. She would receive the villa, a monthly allowance for the duration of her medical treatment, and a lump sum that would cover most of her expenses. He had thought of everything, in the way he always thought of everything, and she understood that this conversation was not the beginning of a negotiation. It was the delivery of a decision that had already been made. She pushed the folder back across the table. She said she wasn't signing anything. He looked at her the way he looked at people who were not yet aware of how things worked. Not contemptuous exactly. More like someone who has seen the same misunderstanding so many times that it has stopped producing any feeling at all. He said she would. He said it the same way he might say that it would rain tomorrow. A statement of fact rather than a threat. She got up from the table. She went into the bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and focused on the sensation of the fabric under her palms until the shaking stopped. Then she picked up her phone and called her friend Kezia, a Kenyan-born nurse who worked at a clinic in Itaewon and had been Nia's closest friend in Seoul for 6 years. Kezia answered on the second ring. Nia said, "He's divorcing me." Silence on the other end. Then, "Because of the diagnosis? He says I'm a liability." Another silence. Then Kezia said something in Swahili that Nia didn't catch and asked if she needed her to come over. Nia said no. She said she was fine. She was not fine. She signed the papers 8 days later. Not because he had worn her down, though the atmosphere in the apartment during those 8 days was something she would not fully be able to describe afterward. The silence, the way he moved through rooms as though she were already gone. The precise, impersonal courtesy with which he spoke to her when they happened to be in the same space. She signed because she understood, with the same bone-deep clarity that had sat in her chest since the parking garage, that fighting him would cost her energy she did not have, and that the war her body was about to wage against itself was going to require everything. She moved into the villa in Mapogu on a Wednesday in November. The first chemotherapy session took place the following Monday. She went alone. The infusion suite at Seongbuk General was quiet at 8 in the morning, 6 reclining chairs in a row, 3 of them occupied by other patients. A nurse named Yoon Ji-hae set up the IV, checked Nia's blood pressure, and talked her through the medication schedule in Korean that Nia understood well enough to follow. The drugs went in through a port they had installed the previous week. The session lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. That evening, back at the villa, Nia ate half a bowl of rice porridge, held it down through what felt like sheer willpower, and called Kezia to report that it had not been as bad as she had expected. By the third session, she stopped being able to keep down anything except ice chips and broth. Her hair began falling out 6 weeks into treatment. She found it on her pillow, in the shower drain, in the bristles of her brush. She cut it short herself first, sitting at the bathroom mirror with a pair of kitchen scissors. And then Keziah came over on a Saturday morning with a set of clippers and finished the job properly. They didn't talk much while it was happening. Keziah was efficient, matter-of-fact, and Nia was grateful for the absence of theater around it. She was grateful for Keziah in general. Without her, the months that followed would have been simply, flatly unsurvivable, because Tae-jin, in the meantime, had moved forward with his life with the same clean efficiency he brought to everything. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, news circulated in the social pages that he was engaged to Yoon Seo-ah, 31, daughter of a prominent Seoul family, photographed at gallery openings and charity events with the polished ease of someone who had been preparing for exactly this role. The announcement generated the kind of social momentum that Tae-jin's world ran on. Congratulations, investment partnerships, dinner invitations. Nia saw it on a news website while sitting in the infusion chair at her 4th treatment, her phone propped against a small pillow on her lap. She set the phone face down and looked at the wall across the room, where someone had hung a photograph of Jeju Island. Green hills, blue water. She looked at it for a long time without seeing it. Keziah called that evening. Nia did not answer. She called back the next morning. By the 6th month of treatment, the cumulative amount was visible in ways that couldn't be managed through routine. She had lost 22 pounds. Her hands developed a persistent tremor from nerve damage. Her heart rate, monitored at every appointment, was irregular in patterns that concerned Dr. Han enough that she adjusted the treatment protocol twice. Nia's kidneys were processing the drugs, but the strain was accumulating. Every organ was doing a calculation, a slow and quiet assessment of how much more it could absorb. She was tired in a way that had no comparison to ordinary fatigue. It was structural. It lived in her bones. She pushed through it because she did not know how to do anything else. The medical bills arrived with the regularity of something mechanical. The settlement allowance from Tae-jin's lawyers covered some of it. Not all. She wrote to the law firm handling the divorce agreement in October, detailing the shortfall, requesting a conversation. The firm forwarded the communication to Tae-jin. His response came back through the firm, 2 sentences, formal, informing her that the settlement terms had been met in full and that any additional medical costs were her own responsibility. She read those 2 sentences twice. Then she set the letter in the folder where she kept her medical paperwork and did not allow herself to think about what they meant, about the man who had written them, about the 9 years that had produced a man capable of writing exactly those words for the rest of that day. She had learned by then that there was a portion of each day that had to be protected from that particular kind of thinking. If you let it in all at once, it would take everything. 9 months after her first chemotherapy session, on a Tuesday morning in late September, Nia's phone rang while she was sitting at the kitchen table of the villa, both hands wrapped around a mug of ginger tea. It was Dr. Han's office. Not the nurse. The doctor herself. Dr. Han asked if Nia could come in that morning. Nia asked if there was something wrong. Dr. Han said she needed to speak with her in person. Nia set down the mug. The tea was still hot. Steam rose from it and dispersed in the kitchen air. She said, "Is it worse? Has it spread?" Dr. Han's voice, usually so controlled, held something unfamiliar. Not grief. Something more complicated than grief. She said, "Mrs. Kang, Miss Brooks, please come in. I can't discuss this over the phone." Nia arrived at the hospital 40 minutes later. Dr. Han met her at the entrance to the oncology unit herself, which had never happened before, and walked her through a different corridor than the usual one, to a conference room rather than an examination room. There was another doctor present, the head of pathology, a man named Dr. Cho, who Nia had never met. A hospital administrator sat at the end of the table. The folder on the table in front of Dr. Han was thick. Nia sat down. She looked at the three people across the table from her and understood, before a single word was spoken, that something had happened that none of them knew how to begin explaining. Dr. Han opened the folder. She placed two sets of documents side by side on the table and turned them so Nia could see. Then she began to speak. And the room, the conference room, the fluorescent light, the thick folder, the administrator's pale face, everything seemed to tilt very slightly, the way the world tilts when your inner ear has stopped receiving accurate information about which way is down. Dr. Han said, "The biopsy that we used to diagnose you 9 months ago, the tissue sample, did not belong to you." Nia heard the words. She heard them clearly, in the careful, slightly stilted English that Dr. Han used when she wanted to be precisely understood. She heard every word. She said, "Say that again." Dr. Han said it again. A laboratory processing error. 2 samples collected on the same morning, labeled with adjacent case numbers. A technician, later identified as a contracted worker named Park Min-seok, had switched the slide labels during processing. Nia's healthy tissue had been assigned to another patient. Another patient's malignant tissue had been assigned to Nia. The other patient, a 53-year-old woman named Mrs. Lim, had received Nia's healthy results. She had been told she was cancer-free. She had not sought further treatment. She had died 4 months later, at home, without knowing she was sick. Nia sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "I don't have cancer." Dr. Han said, "No, you never did." The administrator reached toward the table, some reflexive gesture, and Nia held up one hand and the administrator stopped. Nia said, 9 months of chemotherapy." Dr. Han said yes. Nia said, "My hair." Dr. Han said yes. Nia said nothing for a long moment. She looked at the documents on the table. She looked at Dr. Han's face. She looked at the window at the end of the conference room where the mid-morning sky was the particular pale blue of early autumn in Seoul, and somewhere inside her chest, something that had been holding its shape through sheer pressure for 9 months made a sound she couldn't describe and rearranged itself into something she had never felt before. She said, "I want to know exactly how this happened." Dr. Cho said the investigation was ongoing. She said, "I'm not asking about the investigation. I'm asking you, right now, in this room, to tell me exactly how a laboratory makes this particular mistake." The silence in the conference room lasted several seconds. And then quietly, but with a precision that would later become the foundation of everything that followed, Nia Brooks began to ask the questions that Kang Tae-jin had never imagined she would be alive to ask. The silence in that conference room did not last long, but it had weight. Dr. Cho cleared his throat and began speaking about procedural safeguards and quality control reviews and the hospital's commitment to a thorough internal audit, and Nia listened to approximately 40 seconds of it before she raised her hand again and he stopped. She said, "Who is Park Min-seok?" Dr. Cho looked at the administrator. The administrator looked at the folder. Nia said, "I asked a question." Dr. Cho said Park Min-seok was a contracted laboratory technician who had processed samples in the pathology department during the period in question. He said the man's employment contract had been terminated pending investigation. He said the hospital was cooperating fully with the relevant regulatory authorities. Nia said, "Is he the only one who touched my sample?" Dr. Cho said the chain of custody documentation was being reviewed. She said, "That is not what I asked." Another silence. Dr. Han was watching Nia with an expression that was not quite clinical anymore. Something else had come into it. Something that looked, if Nia had to name it, like the early stages of alarm. Nia picked up her bag from the floor beside her chair. She stood. She was wearing dark slacks and a gray blouse, and she was still thin from 9 months of treatment, still carrying the particular gauntness that chemotherapy leaves behind even after the drugs stop. But she stood in a way that filled the room more than her physical size should have allowed. She told them she would need complete copies of all documentation related to her case, the original biopsy report, the chain of custody logs, the error investigation file, and the personnel records for every individual who had handled her sample. She told them she would be retaining legal counsel and that she expected the hospital's full cooperation. She told them that if any documentation was modified, delayed, or lost between this conversation and the moment her lawyer requested it, she would treat that as an intentional act. The administrator started to say something about hospital privacy protocols. Nia looked at him, just looked, and whatever he saw in her face made him close his mouth and pick up his pen and write something down instead. She walked out of the conference room, down the corridor, through the oncology unit, and out through the hospital's main entrance into the pale September air. She stood on the pavement outside with both hands at her sides and breathed in through her nose, counted 4 seconds, breathed out, did it again. The traffic on the street in front of the hospital moved with indifferent regularity. A delivery scooter cut between 2 taxis. A woman pushed a stroller past the entrance without looking up. Nia stood there for 3 minutes, then she called Kezia. Kezia picked up immediately. She was between patients at the clinic. Nia could hear the background noise of a waiting room, the distant sound of a child crying down a hallway. Nia said, "I never had cancer." The waiting room noise continued for a moment. Then Kezia said, "What?" Nia said it again, slower, all of it. The biopsy error, the switched samples, the other woman who had died, the 9 months of chemotherapy for a disease she never carried. She said it in the flat, precise way she had learned to deliver information in the field, when the information was too large to survive dramatization. When she finished, Kezia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something in Swahili, very quietly, the same phrase she had used the night Tae-jin had handed over the divorce papers, and Nia understood it this time because her Swahili had improved over the years of knowing Kezia, and it was not something she could repeat in any company. Then Kezia said, "Where are you right now?" Nia told her. Kezia said, "Stay there. I'm coming on my lunch break. Don't drive." Nia said she was fine to drive. Kezia said, "I know you are. Stay there anyway." She stayed. They sat in Kezia's car in the hospital parking structure, the engine off, a takeout bag of kimbap between them that neither of them touched. Nia told the whole story again, more slowly this time, filling in the details she had compressed in the first telling. Kezia listened the way she always listened, fully, without interrupting, without performing sympathy, just present in the way that certain people know how to be present. When Nia finished, Kezia said, "What are you going to do?" Nia said, "I'm going to talk to Tae-jin." Kezia went still. Then she said, "Why?" It was not a question, exactly. It was the kind of statement that wears a question's shape but carries a warning inside it. Nia said, "Because he divorced me because he thought I was dying, and I wasn't, and he should know that." Kezia said, "He divorced you because it was inconvenient. The diagnosis was just the reason he used." Nia said, "I know that." Kezia said, "Then what do you actually want from that conversation?" Nia looked at the concrete pillar in front of the car. There was a crack running down its middle, old and settled, the kind of crack that had been there for years and would be there for years more. She said, "I don't know yet." She called Tae-jin's private number that evening from the villa. He picked up on the 4th ring, which meant his assistant had flagged the call as something he should take personally. His voice was the same as it had always been, measured, positioned slightly back from whatever was actually happening, like a man standing one deliberate step behind the moment. He said, "Naya," she said, "I need to meet with you." A pause. She heard background noise, the soft percussion of an upscale restaurant, crystal and low conversation. He was at dinner. Of course he was at dinner. He said, "My schedule is fairly tight this week." She said, It's not a social call, Tejan. It concerns the hospital. Another pause, shorter this time. He said, I can give you 30 minutes Thursday morning. My office. She said, your office. He said, is that a problem? She said it wasn't and hung up. She spent the 2 days before Thursday sitting with herself in a way she had not allowed since the treatment began. The villa had a small garden in the back. Nothing elaborate, a patch of grass, a stone bench, some overgrown rosemary that the previous occupant had planted. She sat on the bench in the evenings with a blanket over her knees because her internal temperature regulation had never fully recovered from the chemotherapy, and she thought about what Kazia had said. What do you actually want from that conversation? She still didn't have a clean answer to that, but she kept coming back to one thing, one specific image, the dining table, the marble surface, the folder sitting between them, the way he had set it down. Precise. Prepared. The way a man sets something down when he has already rehearsed the gesture. That image kept returning, and each time it returned it brought with it a small, cold current that she could not account for by the diagnosis alone. She had been sick. People abandoned sick spouses. It was brutal, and it was common, and she had seen versions of it in women she had worked with across 3 continents. The moment when illness became inconvenience, and inconvenience became burden, and burden became justification. She was not naive about that particular human failure, but the folder had been ready, the settlement documents, the property transfer, the allowance schedule. The legal complexity alone, the number of people who would have needed to prepare that documentation, meant the process had begun well before that conversation. Days before, at least. Possibly longer. He had started the divorce proceedings before she told him about the diagnosis. She sat with that on the stone bench in the dark, the rosemary smell sharp and clean around her, and let it settle into shape. Thursday morning. Tajin's corporate offices occupied 3 floors of a tower in Gangnam, all glass and pale wood, and the specific brand of minimalism that signals money without advertising it. His personal office was on the top floor, corner position, the Han River visible from both window walls. It was the kind of room designed to remind whoever sat across the desk from him that he occupied a different altitude than most people. She had been in this room before, early in their marriage, and she remembered thinking then that it suited him. The deliberate emptiness of it, the absence of personal objects, the way it presented control as an aesthetic. He was standing when she came in, which he had not been doing the first time she'd seen the office. He was in a dark suit, no tie, and he looked, she had to admit this to herself even now, exactly as he always looked. Undisturbed, as though the world arranged itself around him by prior agreement. His assistant closed the door behind her. Nia sat down without being invited to. He sat down across from her and folded his hands on the desk. He said, "You said this was about the hospital." She said, "The biopsy was wrong." He didn't move. She said, "The tissue sample that came back malignant. It wasn't mine." The lab switched samples. A technician named Park Min-seok processed my case alongside another patient's. The labels were transposed. "I never had cancer, Taejin. I spent 9 months in chemotherapy for a disease that was never in my body." She watched his face while she said it. She had spent 2 days thinking about this moment, about what she would see there when the information landed. She had imagined several versions. The controlled surprise of a man who genuinely didn't know. The micro-expression of a man who had already calculated how to respond to this possibility. The shift in the eyes that would tell her something specific. What she saw was stillness, not shock, not calculation warming up behind the eyes, not even relief. Stillness, clean and settled, like a surface that had not been disturbed by something that should have disturbed it. It lasted approximately 1 second. Then he said, "That's a serious allegation against the hospital." She said, "It's not an allegation. The hospital has confirmed it. There will be a negligence suit. The settlement will be significant." He nodded once, slowly. And then he said, "I'm sorry you went through that." The words were correct. The tone was correct. Everything about the delivery was correct. And it was the most frightening thing she had heard him say in 9 years of marriage. Because she had known this man long enough to know the difference between the words he produced and the place they came from, and these words came from nowhere recognizable. She said, You started divorce proceedings before I told you about the diagnosis. He didn't answer immediately. She said, the settlement documents were ready the same night I told you. The legal preparation for that kind of agreement takes time, which means you had already begun the process before you knew I was sick. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, you're going through an extremely difficult experience. It makes sense that you're looking for explanations. She said, don't do that. He said, Nia? She said, don't do that. Don't manage me. I am not one of your business problems. I am asking you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. He was quiet for a long moment. The river outside the window was bright in the morning light, white-capped where the wind caught it. He said, the timing of our divorce was based on many factors. My attorneys can speak to the documentation timeline. She said, that's not a direct answer. He said, it's the answer I'm giving you. She stood up. He said, whatever you're thinking right now, she said, don't. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. With her hand on the handle, she stopped. She did not turn around. She said, 9 months. My heart is damaged. My kidneys are compromised. The doctors have told me I will likely never carry a child. You know what the worst part is? I fought so hard to stay alive. Every single day I got into that chair, and I fought, because I thought I owed it to myself to survive. And the whole time, she stopped, breathed, then she said, I'll be speaking to my lawyers. She walked out of the office, through the corridor, into the elevator, and out through the lobby into the Gangnam morning. The sun was direct and too bright after the controlled climate of the building, and she stood on the pavement and pressed her palm flat against the exterior wall for a moment, the stone warm under her hand. She called Kezia on the walk to the parking structure and said, I need the name of the best litigation attorney in Seoul who has handled medical negligence. Someone aggressive. Someone who doesn't need things to be polite. Kezia said she knew someone. She said, also, she stopped walking for a moment. Is there someone you trust who does private investigations? Not a firm. Someone specific. Someone who knows how to find financial information that people want kept quiet. A pause on Kezia's end. Then Kezia said, why? Nia said, because something doesn't fit. Something about all of this doesn't fit. And I need to know what it is before I decide what to do next. Kezia was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said a name. The attorney was named Lim Dong-wook, 53 years old, a former prosecutor who had spent the last 18 years building a practice that specialized in institutional negligence and corporate malfeasance. He had a face like compressed granite and an office so deliberately ordinary, so stacked files, mismatched chairs, no river views, that it took Nia approximately 20 minutes to realize that the ordinariness was itself a form of positioning. He wanted people to underestimate the room. She liked him immediately. They met on a Friday afternoon. She laid out the facts, all of them, without editorializing. The diagnosis, the treatment, the divorce, the error revelation, the conversation with Tai Jin, the anomaly in the timing. Lim listened without taking notes, which she found either alarming or impressive. When she finished, he leaned back in his mismatched chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He said, the hospital case is straightforward. Catastrophic negligence with documented physical harm. They'll settle fast and large to avoid trial publicity. That's not what concerns me. She said, what concerns you? He said, the husband, the timing you described. He came forward again, elbows on the desk. You said the divorce documentation was prepared before the diagnosis was disclosed to him. She said, that's my assessment based on the complexity of the paperwork. He said, did you retain copies of everything he gave you that night? She said she had. He said, good. I want to see them. He paused. You also mentioned life insurance. Do you know whether he took out any policies on you during the marriage? She said she didn't know. She said she hadn't had reason to think about it before. Lim said, we should find out. He picked up a pen, turned it in his fingers without writing anything. I'm going to recommend someone to work alongside the litigation, an investigator. She's methodical and she's discreet, and she's found things that didn't want to be found before. He looked up. I need to ask you something first, and I need you to answer it honestly. Nia said, ask. He said, Are you prepared for the possibility that what you find is worse than you're currently imagining? The office was quiet. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. Somewhere outside, a truck shifted gears on the street below. Nia said, I spent 9 months believing I was dying. I made peace with a lot of things during that time. She looked at him steadily. Whatever is there, I want to know. Lim nodded. He wrote a name on a card and slid it across the desk. The investigator's name was Choi Yuna. She was 38, compact, with the kind of stillness that suggested she was always calculating the distance between where she was standing and the nearest exit. She met Nia in a coffee shop in Mapogu, near the villa, on a Monday morning, and she spent the first 15 minutes asking questions and the next 30 minutes writing things down in a notebook with a green cover. She did not use a laptop. She said laptops were visible. When the 30 minutes were done, she looked up and said, Financial records and communications from 2 years ago to present. Insurance policies under your name or jointly held. Any third-party payments connected to the pathology department at Seongbuk General. Correct? Nia said, Yes. Choi said, How deep do you want me to go? Nia said, As deep as it goes. Choi tapped her pen twice against the notebook, a small rhythmic gesture that seemed involuntary. Then she said, There's something I always tell new clients at this point. Most people who come to me are looking for confirmation of something they already suspect. About 30% of the time, what they find is worse than what they suspected. About 15% of the time, it's something different entirely. Not worse, just different, and sometimes more complicated. She closed the notebook. A very small number of people, when they find what they were looking for, discover they weren't ready for it after all. Nia said, I understand. Choi said, Good. She stood, tucking the notebook into a canvas bag. I'll be in touch. The weeks that followed had a particular quality to them. Suspended, tensed, like the air before a season changes. Nia managed her medical appointments, the ongoing monitoring of her heart and kidneys, the residual fatigue that still required her to rest in the afternoons. She met twice more with Lim Dong-wook as the hospital's legal team initiated contact. She walked in the evenings along the Han River path near the villa, sometimes with Keziah, sometimes alone, and she thought about the conversation in Tae Jin's office, the stillness in his face, the way the information had landed without appearing to land at all. She thought about the divorce folder, ready on the table. She thought about the papers, the timing. She thought about the fact that he had never asked, not once in any of the conversations they had exchanged since she told him her diagnosis, whether she had a support system, whether she was managing, whether she was afraid. A man who had once known her well enough to know she took her tea without sugar, who had known that she couldn't sleep with the window closed, who had once driven 4 hours to meet her at the airport after a delayed flight from Manila because she had sounded tired on the phone. That man had looked at her across a marble table and produced a settlement folder without a single question about how she was going to get through what was coming. She kept returning to that. The absence of curiosity, the absence of the specific questions that love, even residual love, even love that had cooled into something less, would have produced. It wasn't grief she felt about it, exactly. It was something colder and more specific, a recognition assembling itself out of pieces she had not known she was collecting. Choi Yuna called on a Wednesday evening, 5 weeks into the investigation. She asked if Nia was at home. Nia said she was. Choi said she was coming over. She arrived 40 minutes later, the green notebook under her arm, and she sat at Nia's kitchen table and placed 3 printed documents on the surface between them. She did not preface them with anything. She simply laid them down and let Nia look. The first document was a summary of 4 life insurance policies. All 4 had been taken out in Nia's name, with Tae-jin as beneficiary, over a period of 8 months beginning approximately 14 months ago. The combined payout value was $14,800,000. The second document was a summary of financial transactions from an account registered to a shell company linked through 2 intermediaries to Kang Tae-jin's personal holdings. 3 payments had been made from that account to a personal bank account registered in the name of Park Min-seok. The first payment predated Nia's biopsy by 11 days. The second came 4 days after the biopsy results were released. The third came 2 weeks after the divorce papers were signed. The third document was a partial chain of custody log from Seongbuk General Hospital's pathology department, annotated by Choi in red ink, showing Park Min-seok as the sole handler of both Nia's sample and Mrs. Lim's sample on the morning of processing. Nia sat at the table and read each document once, then she read them again. The kitchen was very quiet. The small clock on the wall ticked. Outside, the street was empty except for the distant sound of a bus making its stop 2 blocks away. She looked up from the documents and across the table at Choi, who was watching her with the careful, level attention of someone who has delivered this kind of material before and understands that the next several seconds belong entirely to the person receiving it. Nia said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "He paid someone to switch my biopsy." Choi said, "That is what this evidence suggests, yes." Nia said, "So that I would undergo chemotherapy for cancer I didn't have." Choi said, "Yes." Nia said, "And when the treatment killed me, he would collect $15 million. Choi said, 14.8, yes. The clock on the wall ticked 4 times. Nia placed both palms flat on the table, on either side of the documents, and looked at them, really looked, the way she had looked at supply manifests in the field when the numbers didn't match and she needed to understand not just what was missing, but who had taken it, and why, and what it meant for the people depending on those supplies to arrive. She understood now what she had not been ready to understand in Taijin's office, what some part of her had been circling for weeks without landing on directly. The divorce had not been the cruelty. The divorce had been the architecture. It had positioned her outside his household, removed her from his social circle, and placed her, isolated, ill, foreign, alone, in a villa where she would spend the next several months dying slowly in a city that did not belong to her, with no family nearby, and a disease she had been given no reason to question. He had not abandoned her when she got sick. He had made her sick so he could watch her die and collect the money and walk into a wedding with Yoon Seo-ah with clean hands and a legitimate grief story, and $15 million he could run through his organization without anyone asking too many questions about where it came from. She had survived it, not because he had miscalculated the toxicity of the drugs, or because she had somehow fought off a cancer she never had, but because the woman whose sample had been used to condemn her had died before anyone thought to recheck the original processing logs, and a diligent junior technician in the pathology department, conducting a routine quality review 18 months after the fact, had found a clerical inconsistency that had unraveled everything. She had survived by accident. He had nearly gotten away with it. She looked at Choi across the table and said, "I need you to secure these documents, originals and copies. I need them in 3 separate locations. I need a chain of custody that a federal prosecutor can use in court." Choi said, "Already in progress." Nia said, "And Park Min-seok, where is he now?" Choi said, "Currently unemployed, living in Incheon. He has no criminal record and no apparent awareness that the financial trail connecting him to your husband has been reconstructed." Nia nodded once. She picked up the documents, stacked them carefully, and set them at the edge of the table. Her hands were not shaking. She noted this with a kind of distant precision, the way she noted clinical facts about herself. The absence of tremor as information, as data about the current state of things. She said, "Call Lim Dong-wook. Tell him we need to meet tomorrow morning, early." Choi said, "First thing." Nia said, "And Choi..." Choi paused at the kitchen doorway. Nia said, "You told me some clients, when they find what they were looking for, discover they weren't ready for it." Choi said, "I did." Nia said, "I was ready." Choi looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and let herself out. Nia sat at the table after the door closed. The documents sat at the edge of the table. The clock ticked. Somewhere in the wall, the heating system made a small, settling sound. She had one more thing to do before morning. She picked up her phone and found a contact she had not called in 6 months. A senior investigator at the Korea Financial Intelligence Unit named Baek Sung-min, a man she had met 3 years earlier through a mutual contact in the NGO sector. A man who had once told her over coffee that the most useful thing about criminal organizations was that they all believed, eventually, that they were smarter than the paper trail. She dialed. He picked up on the second ring. She said, "Inspector Bayek, my name is Nia Brooks. We met in 2021 at a conference in Ituan. I don't know if you remember me." A brief pause. Then, "I remember you." She said, "I have evidence of conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and systematic medical corruption involving one of the most significant organized crime figures currently operating in South Korea." She paused. "I believe you will want to see it before anyone else does." The silence on the other end of the line was the particular silence of a man who has just understood that the conversation he thought he was entering is something significantly larger than he anticipated. Then Inspector Beck said, "Where are you right now?" And Nia told him. And outside the villa, the Seoul night pressed against the windows, and somewhere across the city, in a tower above the Han River, Kang Tae-jin sat at a dinner table with Yoon Seo-ah and raised a glass of wine, and had no idea that the woman he had arranged to kill was, at this precise moment, making the phone call that would end. The phone call lasted 19 minutes. Inspector Baek Sung-min asked questions in the precise, unhurried way of a man who had learned that the quality of information depended entirely on the quality of the questions, and Nia answered each one with the same flat precision she had used in the conference room at the hospital. Dates, names, document references, the sequence of events in the order they had occurred. She did not editorialize. She did not tell him what she thought it meant. She gave him the architecture and let him build his own reading of it. When she finished, he said, "Don't discuss this with anyone you haven't already discussed it with." She said she understood. He said, "The documents, physical copies and digital, I need them secured in a location that isn't your residence." She said Choi Yuna had already begun that process. A pause. Then, "You hired Choi Yuna." Nia said yes. He said, "All right." Something shifted in his voice. Not warmth exactly, but a recalibration of whatever initial assessment he had been running. "I'm going to make 2 calls tonight. I'll contact you tomorrow before 9. Do not reach out to the hospital, to Kang Tae-jin, or to Park Min-seok between now and then." Nia said, "Understood." He said, "Ms. Brooks, this is going to move quickly once it begins. Are you prepared for that?" She said, I've been preparing for 9 months. I just didn't know what I was preparing for." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said goodnight, and the line went dead. She set the phone on the table beside the stacked documents and sat in the kitchen until past midnight, not moving much, not thinking in any linear way, just letting the full weight of the evening settle into her body the way cold settles into a room when the heat goes off. The clock on the wall ticked. The street outside stayed empty. At some point, she made tea she didn't drink, and then she went to bed and lay on top of the covers fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling until somewhere around 3 in the morning, her body simply stopped holding itself awake. She slept 4 hours. At 8:47 the next morning, Inspector Baek called back. He said, "I spoke with the prosecutor's office last night. There is sufficient preliminary basis to open a formal investigation. A team will take custody of your documents this morning. Choi Yuna has already been contacted." He paused. "I need you to come in for a formal interview this afternoon. 2 o'clock. Bring your attorney." She called Lim Dong-wook at 9. He said he would meet her at the prosecutor's office at 1:30. He sounded, for the first time since she had met him, like a man who was suppressing the desire to say something that wasn't strictly professional. She asked him what he was thinking. He said, "I'm thinking that if the financial connections hold up under forensic audit, what you have is not a negligence case. What you have is a premeditated murder conspiracy executed through institutional corruption against a sitting major crime organization's leadership." He paused. "I have been practicing law for 30 years. I have not had a case like this before." She said, "Is that good or bad?" He said, "For you, potentially good. For Kang Tae-jin, catastrophic." Another pause. "For the case itself, complex. These things have a way of developing unexpected complications." She asked what kind of complications. He said, "The kind we deal with when they arrive. 1:30, don't be late." She wasn't. The interview at the prosecutor's office lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes. 2 investigators conducted it. A senior prosecutor named O.G. Hyun, sharp-eyed and methodical, who had handled organized crime cases for 11 years, and a younger investigator named Sergeant Kim, who took notes with the focused intensity of someone who understood that the notes he was taking today might matter in a courtroom in 18 months. Lim sat beside Nia throughout and intervened twice. Once to clarify the legal parameters of Choi's investigative work, once to object to a line of questioning about Nia's financial arrangements with Tae-jin during the marriage. Both times Oh Ji-hyun noted his objection and redirected without argument, which told Nia that Oh was more interested in building a case than in winning the room. She answered every question she was asked. She did not speculate beyond what the documents supported. When she didn't know something, she said she didn't know. At the end of the session, Oh Ji-hyun set her pen down on the table and looked at Nia directly for the first time since they had begun. She said, "I want to be transparent with you about the current state of this. The financial evidence is significant. The chain of custody log is significant. What we need, to take this from a financial crime case to a murder conspiracy charge, is testimony. Park Min-seok is the critical link. If he corroborates the transaction records with a direct account of what he was paid to do and by whom, this becomes a different kind of case entirely." She paused. If he refuses, or if his account contradicts the financial record, we have a strong fraud case but a much harder road to the conspiracy charge. Nia said, "Has he been contacted?" Oh said, "Not yet. That happens this week." She picked up her pen again. "Miss Brooks, I want to ask you something, and I need you to think before you answer. To your knowledge, does Kang Tae-jin have any indication that this investigation is opening?" Nia thought about it. She thought about the conversation in his office, his stillness, the way the information about the biopsy error had landed without disturbing his surface. She thought about the fact that his organization's entire operational model was built on knowing things before other people knew them. She said, "I don't know, but I would not assume that he doesn't." Oh wrote something. She did not share what. The following week was the longest of Nia's life, and that was a significant claim given the 9 months that had preceded it. She went to her medical appointments. She ate. She slept in pieces. She did not call anyone she didn't need to call. Kazuya came to the villa on Tuesday evening, and they sat in the back garden in the dark and talked about things that had nothing to do with Tae-jin or biopsy reports or insurance policies, Kazuya's difficult patient that week, a film they had both seen years ago and disagreed about, the overgrown rosemary that had started to take over the left side of the stone bench. It was the most normal 2 hours Nia had experienced in longer than she could immediately calculate, and she held on to them the way you hold on to something you know might not come back. Thursday afternoon, Lim called. He said, "Park Min-seok agreed to speak with investigators this morning." Nia sat down on the edge of her bed. Lim said, "The interview lasted 4 hours. I don't have the full transcript that's held within the investigation, but I have a contact in the prosecutor's office who confirmed that he provided a detailed account of his contact with a third party regarding Nia's biopsy." A pause. He initially claimed the third party was an anonymous intermediary he never met in person. That account held for approximately 90 minutes. Then the investigators placed the financial transaction records in front of him. She said, "And?" Lim said, "He asked for a lawyer and a deal." She said, "They'll give him one?" Lim said, "They will offer him a reduced charge in exchange for full testimony naming the individual who contracted him and describing the specific instructions he received. Oh Ji-hyun will push for complete cooperation on all associated transactions." He paused again. "This is the pivot point, Nia. If his testimony is detailed and holds up under cross-examination, they have what they need to file conspiracy charges." She said, "When?" He said, "About days, maybe a week." She said, "Tae-jin can't know about this before they move." Lim said, "The investigation team is aware of that. They are moving as quickly as the legal framework allows." He stopped. Then he said, "There's one more thing. Something that came up this morning that I need to tell you about." His tone had shifted. Not dramatically. Lim Dong-wook was not a dramatic man, but enough. She said, "Tell me." He said, "During the financial review, investigators found a secondary set of transactions that Choi's initial sweep did not capture. They were routed through a different intermediary structure than the payments to Park. He was choosing his words with care now. That specific attorney's care that she had learned meant the information was significant and possibly destabilizing. The transactions indicate payments to an individual at Seongbuk General Hospital, not in the pathology department, in the administrative office. He paused. Specifically, the office responsible for assigning patient case numbers. Nia was very still. Lim said, "The implication, and investigators are still verifying this, is that the biopsy sample switch was not an improvised act by Park Min-seok alone. The case number assignment, the specific pairing of your sample with Mrs. Lim's, may have been deliberately arranged before the samples even reached the pathology lab, which means Park Min-seok was not the architect. He was a component." Nia said, "Someone set up the pairing." Lim said, "That appears to be what the records suggest. Someone ensured that your sample and a confirmed cancer patient's sample were processed on the same morning by the same technician in adjacent slots." She said, "Which means Taijin had at least 2 people inside that hospital." Lim said, "At minimum." She sat with that. The wall across from her bed had a small watercolor painting on it, something abstract in blues and grays that had come with the villa and that she had never paid much attention to. She looked at it now. She said, "The other person, the one in the administrative office, do they know investigators have found the transactions?" Lim said, "Not yet." She said, "Taijin does?" Lim said, "That we don't know." She said, "Lim, what happens if he finds out before they move on Park's testimony?" A long pause. Lim said, "He has the resources to complicate things significantly. Witnesses can become unreachable. Evidence chains can develop gaps. Organized crime cases at this level have collapsed before because the window between evidence and arrest was not closed quickly enough." He stopped. "I'm going to have a conversation with Oh Ji-hyun tomorrow morning about accelerating the timeline." She said, "Good." He said, "Nia, I need you to stay inside this process. Don't do anything unilateral." She said, "I know." He said, "I mean it." She said, "Lim, I know." She did know. And for the next 4 days, she stayed inside the process, managing the tight, compressed anxiety of waiting with the same discipline she had applied to the chemotherapy sessions. 1 day at a time, 1 appointment at a time, 1 piece of information at a time, no projection beyond what was currently knowable. On the 5th day, Kezia called at 6 in the morning. Nia was already awake. She picked up before the second ring. Kezia's voice was wrong. Not panicked. Kezia was not a woman who panicked, but compressed in a way that meant she was controlling something that wanted to be larger. She said, "Are you watching the news?" Nia said, "No, what happened?" Kezia said, "Turn on the news. Channel 7. Nia found the remote and turned on the small television on the dresser. Channel 7 was in the middle of a breaking news segment. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, in Korean, "Seongbuk General Hospital pathology worker found dead. Incheon. Investigation ongoing." Park Min-seok's photograph was on the screen. His employment photo from the hospital, slightly too formal for his face, the way employment photos always were. Nia sat down on the edge of the bed with the remote still in her hand. Kezia said, "Nia." She said, "I see it." Kezia said, "Is this?" She said, "Yes." The news segment cut to a reporter outside by a neighbor. Initial assessment suggested cardiac event. An autopsy had been ordered. Investigators were at the scene. Cardiac event. She stared at the screen for a moment. Then she said, "I need to call Lim." Kezia said, "Call me back." She dialed Lim. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he was already awake, which meant he had already seen it. He said, "I know." She said, "They got to him." Lim said, "We don't know that yet. The autopsy will..." She said, "Lim?" He stopped. She said, "We both know what that is." A long silence. Then he said, "Yes, I believe we do." She said, "His testimony, the deal he was negotiating, how much of it was documented before last night?" Lim said, "The initial interview was recorded in full, but the formal written testimony, the signed, notarized account that forms the evidentiary foundation, had not yet been completed. He was scheduled to give it tomorrow morning." She pressed her fingers to her forehead. The television was still on, still showing the apartment building in Incheon, the reporter still talking. She said, "So he's gone and the written testimony is gone with him." Lim said, "The recorded interview exists. It has evidentiary value, but a recorded interview with a deceased witness who cannot be cross-examined is significantly harder to build a conspiracy charge on than a signed living testimony." He paused. "It's not over. The financial records still exist. The administrative employee at the hospital is still alive and does not yet know that investigators have identified her. The insurance policies are documented. The investigation continues." She said, "But the clearest line between Tae-jin and the biopsy switch just died in an apartment in Incheon." Lim said, "Yes." She turned off the television. She sat in the sudden quiet of the bedroom with the remote in her lap and felt something happening in her chest. Not grief, not quite fear, something older and more primitive than either, the sensation of a structure she had been building carefully, piece by piece, for weeks, developing a crack she had not accounted for and could not yet measure. She said, "He knew." Lim said, "It appears that way." She said, "He knew about the investigation. He knew about Park. He moved before we could close it." Lim said, "Which means someone in or adjacent to the investigation communicated the timeline to him." He said it carefully, the way you say something that has very large implications when you are not yet ready to name all of them. She said, "Someone in the prosecutor's office." Lim said, "Or adjacent to it." "I don't want to." She said, "Lim, say it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It is possible that Kang Tae-jin has an informant inside the investigation. At what level I cannot say. But the speed of this, if Park was killed specifically to prevent his signed testimony from being completed, someone communicated the timeline with sufficient accuracy to act on it." The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the first gray light of morning was beginning at the edges of the sky. A bird started somewhere in the garden, a small, mechanical sound, and then stopped. She said, "What does Oh Ji-hyun say?" Lim said, "I haven't reached her yet. I will in the next hour." He paused. "Nia, I need you to hear me. This changes the case, but it does not end it. The financial evidence is significant. The administrative connection at the hospital is still viable. She said, "He has someone inside the investigation." Lim said, "Possibly." She said, "Which means everything we share through official channels, he knows." Lim said nothing. She said, "Which means the investigation itself is compromised. Which means the thing I've been relying on to protect me may be the thing that's been telling him how much time he has." Lim said, "I'm going to have a very direct conversation with Oh Ji-hyun this morning about internal security protocols." She said, "And if Oh Ji-hyun is the source?" The silence this time was different, longer, heavier. Lim said, "Then we have a significantly more complex problem." She said, "Yes." She hung up. She set the phone on the nightstand. She sat on the edge of the bed in the gray morning light with her hands in her lap and looked at the watercolor painting on the wall, the blues and grays, abstract and cool, and understood that she had arrived at a place she had not fully mapped when she had begun moving toward it. She had trusted the process. She had stayed inside the channels. She had delivered her evidence through proper instruments to people with the legal authority to act on it, because that was what you did, because that was how things were supposed to work, because she was not Kang Tae-jin and she did not operate in the spaces between legality, and she had no intention of becoming something she would not recognize. And he had moved anyway. He had reached inside the machine she had set in motion and removed the piece that would have been most damaging to him, and he had done it before the machine could close around him, and he had done it because someone inside the machine had told him exactly where to reach. The process had a hole in it, and Park Min-seok was dead. She picked up the phone again. She did not call Lim. She did not call Kezia. She called Choi Yuna. Choi answered on the second ring and said nothing, which was her habit. Nia said, "You've seen the news." Choi said, 20 minutes ago. Nia said, The investigation has a leak. Choi said, yes. Nia said, the official channel is compromised. Whatever moves through Oh Ji-hyun's office, Tae-jin has access to. Choi said, that is my assessment. Nia said, which means the administrative employee at the hospital, the one who arranged the case number pairing, if investigators move on her through official channels, he'll know before they get to her. Choi said, yes. Nia said, can you find her before they move? Independently, outside the official process. A pause. Not hesitation. Choi Yuna did not hesitate in the way most people hesitated. It was a calculating pause, the pause of someone running a rapid assessment. Choi said, I already know who she is. I identified her 2 days ago and held the information pending confirmation. Another pause. Her name is Jung-hae Won. She's 51. She's worked in the hospital's administrative intake department for 14 years. She has a daughter in university and approximately $40,000 in debt she cannot account for on her salary. Nia said, Tae-jin paid her. While Choi said, the transaction record suggests a single payment made 18 months ago, 3 weeks before your biopsy was scheduled. Nia said, she's alive. Choi said, as of this morning, yes. Nia said, he doesn't know investigators found her. Choi said, not through the official channel, because I found her independently, and the information hasn't entered the official record yet. She paused. But if Oh Ji-hyun's office identifies her through their own parallel review, which they will eventually, and if the leak operates the way it appears to operate, then the window is limited. Nia said, how limited? Choi said, days, possibly less. Nia said, can you reach her? A longer pause this time. Choi said, I can find her. Reaching her, speaking with her directly, outside official channels, before investigators do, is a different question. It carries legal risk for you. If she becomes a formal witness, any prior contact could complicate the evidentiary chain. Nia said, and if we don't reach her, and Tae-jin does first? Choi said nothing for a moment. Then she said, I'll find her location today. Nia said, don't tell Lim yet. Choi said, are you sure? Nia thought about Lim's voice on the phone an hour ago. Careful, measured, working within a framework she respected, but that had just demonstrated a gap large enough to kill a man through. She thought about 9 months of chemotherapy. She thought about Park Min-seok's employment photo on the television screen, too formal for his face. She said, not yet. Find her first. She stood up from the bed, went to the window. The garden was fully light now, the rosemary moving slightly in the morning wind, the stone bench casting a short shadow in the early sun. She had started this believing that truth, delivered through the right channels to the right people with the right authority, was sufficient. She had believed that because it was what she had believed in every disaster zone she had ever worked in, that systems, however imperfect, could be made to function if you gave them the right information clearly enough. Kang Tae-jin had built his entire life on the knowledge that systems had seams, and that the people who understood where the seams were could reach through them at will. She had been playing by rules he had never agreed to follow. That ended now. She turned from the window and picked up her jacket from the chair by the door, and for the first time since the conference room at the hospital, since the moment Dr. Han had set 2 documents side by side on the table and turned them so she could see, Nia Brooks felt something move through the exhaustion and the damage and the accumulated weight of everything that had been done to her body and her life. Something she had not let herself feel because she had not trusted herself with it until this moment. It was not rage. Rage was hot and imprecise, and it cost you things you couldn't afford to lose. It was colder than that, more deliberate. The thing that takes over when every other option has been tried, and the only thing left is the version of you that knows, without sentiment or performance, exactly what needs to happen. Choi found Jung-hae Won at 7:43 that morning. She sent Nia a single text message, an address in Eunpyeong-gu, a neighborhood in the northwestern part of the city, residential, the kind of area where the buildings were older and the streets narrowed without warning. Below the address, a time, 9 a.m. Below that, 3 words. She doesn't know. Nia was in the car by 8:15. She drove north through the morning traffic with both hands on the wheel and the heating off because she needed the cold air to keep her thinking straight. The city moved around her in the particular way of Seoul mornings, compressed, purposeful, everyone operating on their own internal calculation of where they needed to be and how much time they had. She had lived in this city for 9 years. She knew its rhythms the way you know the rhythms of a place you have chosen rather than been born into, consciously, with a slight effort that never fully disappears. She thought about what she was doing. She was going to speak to a woman who had accepted money to arrange the administrative pairing that had sent a false cancer diagnosis into Nia's file. A woman who had, whether she fully understood the downstream consequences or not, been one of the first links in a chain that had taken 9 months of Nia's life, destroyed her fertility, damaged her heart, and killed a 53-year-old woman named Mrs. Lim, who had died at home without knowing she was sick. She was going to speak to this woman outside official channels, without her attorney present, without the knowledge of the investigators handling the case, in a way that Lim Dong-wook would describe as legally complex, and that a less careful man would simply call reckless. She was going to do it because Park Min-seok was dead, and the official process had a hole in it the size of a man's body, and because Jung Hae-won was currently alive and currently unaware, and that window would not stay open. She found the building on a narrow street 2 blocks from a small park. 6 stories, concrete, the kind of construction that had gone up fast in the 90s and showed its age in the staining on the exterior walls and the replacement windows that didn't quite match the frames. Choi was waiting at the base of the steps outside, canvas bag over one shoulder, the green notebook in her hand. Nia parked and got out. The morning air was sharp and carried the smell of someone frying something in a unit above the street. Choi said, "4th floor, she's home. Her shift doesn't start until noon." She paused. "She lives alone. Her daughter's at a university in Daejeon." Nia said, "Does she know who I am?" Choi said, "She knows the name Nia Brooks from the hospital records she handled. Whether she has followed the news about the biopsy error, I don't know." Nia said, "I'm going up alone." Choi said, "That's not..." Nia said, "If she sees 2 of us, she'll shut the door. One woman, alone, has a better chance of getting 30 seconds before she panics." She looked at Choi. "Wait here. If I'm not down in 40 minutes, call Lim." Choi looked at her for a moment with that measuring stillness. Then she said, "Don't threaten her. Don't tell her what you know before you understand what she knows." Nia said, "I know how to have a conversation." She went inside. The elevator was out of service. She took the stairs, 4 flights, and felt the familiar complaint in her knees. Another residual gift from the chemotherapy, the joint inflammation that her doctors said would improve, but had not yet improved to any noticeable degree. She climbed at a steady pace, one hand on the railing, and by the time she reached the 4th floor landing, her breathing was slightly elevated and she stood for a moment in the stairwell and let it level before she pushed open the door to the corridor. 412. The door was metal, painted dark green, with a small name card holder beside it that was empty. She knocked. Silence inside. Then the sound of movement, unhurried, someone crossing a room. The peephole darkened briefly, then nothing. Nia said in Korean, "Jung Hae-won, my name is Nia Brooks. I was a patient at Seongbuk General Hospital. I need 5 minutes." Silence. She said, "I'm alone. I'm not here with investigators. I'm not recording this conversation." She paused. "I think you already know who I am. I think you have known since the news broke about the biopsy error. I think you have been waiting for someone to come to this door, and I think you would rather it be me than the people it will be if you don't open it right now." A long pause. Long enough that she thought the door wasn't going to open. Then she heard the chain slide. Jung Hae-won was 51 years old and looked, in this moment, like someone who had not slept more than 2 hours a night in the 6 weeks since the biopsy error had become public news. She was a small woman, slight, with dark circles that had passed beyond the cosmetically manageable and into something structural, and her hands on the door edge had the tight, controlled stillness of someone who was holding themselves together through effort rather than ease. She looked at Nia. Nia looked at her. Hae-won stepped back from the door without a word, and Nia came inside. The apartment was small and very clean, the cleanliness of someone who manages anxiety through order. A small table with 2 chairs. A kitchen visible through an open doorway. On the table, a cup of tea that was still steaming and a phone turned face down, which told Nia that Hae-won had been sitting there when she knocked and had not been doing anything except sitting. Nia sat down at the table without being invited. Hae-won remained standing near the door for a moment, then came and sat across from her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Hae-won said, in a voice that was very controlled and very tired, "How did you find me?" Nia said, "That's not the conversation we need to have." Hae-won looked at the table. Nia said, "Park Min-seok is dead." Hae-won's face did not change, but her hands, resting on the table, shifted. A small, involuntary tightening, the fingers curling slightly inward. She knew. Nia said, "You heard about it this morning." Hae-won said nothing. Nia said, "He was going to testify. He had agreed to a deal. His formal testimony was scheduled for tomorrow morning, and he died last night of a cardiac event." She let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. "You know what that means?" Hae-won said very quietly, "I don't know anything." Nia said, "You know exactly what it means. It means the man who connected the financial transactions to the physical act of switching my biopsy is gone. It means the clearest direct line between what happened to me and the person who arranged it has been removed." She paused. "And it means that you are now the last surviving person who has direct knowledge of how my case file was set up before it ever reached the pathology lab." Hae-won's breathing had changed. Not dramatically, she was controlling it, but Nia could see it in the slight rise and fall of her shoulders, the way her chest was working a little harder than the conversation required. Nia said, "He knows investigators haven't identified you yet, but they will. Their financial review will get there within days, maybe less. When it does, and when that information moves through the official channel..." She stopped. "You understand what I'm telling you?" Hae-won looked up from the table for the first time. Her eyes were dry, but the skin around them was tight with something that wasn't going to stay contained indefinitely. She said, "I didn't know what it was for." Nia said, "Tell me." Hae-won said, "I was approached by an intermediary, not by him directly, a man I'd never met, through a colleague who I later understood had been paid to make the introduction. The intermediary said a private client needed a specific scheduling arrangement in the pathology intake queue. 2 samples from the same appointment window to be processed in adjacent slots by the same technician." She stopped, swallowed. "He said it was related to a civil dispute, an insurance claim. He said no one would be harmed." Nia said, $40,000. Hae-won went very still. Nia said, "That's what the transaction record shows. A single payment, 18 months ago." She kept her voice even, flat, clinical. "You have a daughter in university." Hae-won said, "Don't." Nia said, "I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you that I know why you did it, and I'm telling you that the reason doesn't matter anymore because a woman named Mrs. Lim died at home from cancer she didn't know she had because she received my healthy biopsy results. And I spent 9 months in chemotherapy for a disease that was never in my body. And my heart is damaged and my kidneys are compromised and I will never carry a child. And the man who paid you to make that scheduling arrangement is now the only person left who can be directly connected to all of it. And he has already demonstrated this week that he is willing to remove that connection by whatever means are available to him." The room was completely silent. Hae-won pressed both hands flat on the table, the same gesture Nia had made at her own kitchen table the night Choi had laid down the documents, as though the table's surface were the only solid thing available. She said, "If I testify..." Nia said, "You need to do it before the official investigation identifies you through their own review. You need to go directly today to a prosecutor outside the current investigative team, and you need to give a full account before the information that you exist enters the channel that is compromised." She paused. "Lim Dong-wook is my attorney. He is not connected to the leak. I can have him on the phone in 10 minutes. He will walk you through what a cooperation agreement looks like. Haewon said, I could go to prison. Nia said, You could. That depends on what you give them and how completely you give it. She looked at the woman across the table from her, the exhausted face, the controlled hands, the cup of tea going cold between them. Or you can wait. You can wait for the official investigation to find you through the compromised channel, and you can find out whether Kang Tai-jin moves on the information before they do, and you can calculate your odds from there. She paused. Park Min-sok waited. The silence after that lasted a long time. Then Haewon said, Call your lawyer. Nia had Lim on the phone within 4 minutes. She handed it to Haewon and went to stand at the apartment window while they spoke, looking down at the narrow street below, at Choi standing at the base of the building steps with her canvas bag and her green notebook, her face tilted up toward the 4th floor window. The call lasted 22 minutes. When it was done, Haewon set the phone on the table and sat looking at it for a moment. She said, He wants me at his office this afternoon. He says he can arrange a direct submission to a senior prosecutor outside the current investigative team by end of day. Nia said, Can you be there? Haewon said, Yes. Nia picked up the phone. She said, I'll take you. Haewon looked at her, a long, complicated look, the kind that contained several things that weren't going to be said aloud. Then she got up and went to get her coat. They were in Lim's office by early afternoon. The submission to the alternate prosecutorial channel, Senior Prosecutor Yo Sang-il, a colleague of Oh Ji-hyun's but operating out of a separate division with no documented overlap in investigative personnel, was filed by 4:47 that same afternoon. Haewon's account was detailed, specific, and covered not only the scheduling arrangement she had been paid to make, but the intermediary who had approached her, the colleague who had made the introduction, and a physical description of every interaction she had with the payment process. When it was done, Lim walked her out of the office to arrange protective custody through a channel that did not pass through Oh Ji-hyun's division. Nia sat in the mismatched chair in Lim's ordinary office and felt the specific exhaustion of a day that had required more of her than most days and that had still not finished requiring things. Lim came back in and sat down across from her. He looked at her for a moment. He said, You understand that what you did this morning was legally significant. She said, I know. He said, If defense counsel argues that Haewon's cooperation was obtained under duress or with advance knowledge of the investigation, she said, Lim. He stopped. She said, Is her testimony usable? He said, Yes. What she provided is a voluntary cooperation agreement initiated through proper legal channels. The manner in which she became aware of the option to cooperate is a separate question that we will manage if it arises. He paused. I am not going to ask you exactly what you said to her. She said, Good. He said, I am going to tell you that Yo Sang-il, after reviewing Haewon's submission alongside the existing financial records and the recorded interview with Park Min-seok, has indicated sufficient basis to file charges. He let that land. He is moving on it tomorrow morning. She said, Tae-jin. Lim said, An arrest warrant will be filed at 9 a.m. Execution of the warrant is currently planned for. He paused, and she understood the pause, understood that he was choosing whether to tell her this particular detail. He told her. His wedding. 3 days from now. The venue is monitored. The investigative team under Yo will be in position before the ceremony begins. She sat with that. She said, They're going to arrest him at the wedding. Lim said, At the moment most likely to prevent flight. His travel documents have been flagged, but a public venue with confirmed attendance is considered the most controlled environment for execution of the warrant given his security arrangements. She thought about Yoon Seo-ah, who was 31 years old and had been photographed at gallery openings with the polished ease of someone who had been preparing for exactly this role. She thought about what it would mean for a woman to be standing in a wedding venue and have armed investigators walk through the door. She said, Seo-ah doesn't know. Lim said, There is no evidence she has any knowledge of or involvement in the conspiracy. Nia said, No, there wouldn't be. She looked at the wall. He's very careful about what he shows people. The next 3 days moved in a way that defied their actual duration. 72 hours that felt simultaneously endless and compressed, like the hours before a flight when you have packed and there is nothing left to do and the waiting is its own kind of labor. Nia went to a cardiology appointment on the second day. Her heart rate was still irregular in the patterns that concerned Dr. Han. The cardiologist adjusted her medication and told her to avoid high-stress situations where possible, and she almost said something and then did not. She called her mother in Atlanta on the evening of the second day, the first time they had spoken in 2 weeks. Her mother was 71 and had the specific maternal intuition of a woman who had raised 3 children through difficult things and had learned to hear what wasn't being said. She said, "You sound different." Nia said, "Different how?" Her mother said, "Like you've made up your mind about something." Nia said, "I'm okay, Mama." Her mother said, "I know you are. That's not what I said." They talked for 40 minutes about other things, and when she hung up, Nia sat with the phone in her hand for a while in the dark of the villa living room, and she thought about what her mother would say if she knew everything. Not the sanitized version, not the version she had been carefully managing across these phone calls, but the whole thing, the biopsy and the chemotherapy and the divorce folder and the insurance policies and Park Min Seok dead in Incheon and Jung Hai Wan's hands tied on her own kitchen table. She thought her mother would have driven to the airport that same night. She didn't call back. The morning of the wedding, she was awake before 5. She had not been invited to participate in the arrest operation. She was a victim and a witness and a central figure in the civil and criminal proceedings, and Lim had been very clear that her presence anywhere near the venue would create complications that could affect the admissibility of evidence and the conduct of the trial. She understood this. She agreed with it. She stayed at the villa. She made coffee at 5:30 and sat at the kitchen table with it, the same table where Choi had laid down the 3 documents, the same chair, the same window showing the same dark garden. The rosemary was just visible in the pre-dawn light, a dark shape against the lighter dark of the grass. At 7:15, Lim sent a text. "Team in position. Warrant confirmed. Will update." At 9:44, he called. She picked up before the ring finished. He said, "It's done." She said nothing. He said, "The warrant was executed at 9:27 a.m. Kang Tai-jin was taken into custody inside the venue before the ceremony began. He did not resist." A pause. There were cameras present. News broadcast teams had been positioned outside the venue for coverage of the wedding. The arrest was... He paused again. It was visible. She said, "Was he at..." She stopped. Started again. "How did he look?" Lim said, "Wasn't there, but from what Yo's office described..." He stopped. He was very still. They said he was completely still when they came through the door. Like he had known, on some level, that this was always how it was going to end. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, against the irregular heart that the chemotherapy had left her with, and held it there for a moment. She said, "And Seoa?" Lim said, "She was escorted out by a female officer before the arrest was completed. She is not a suspect. She is being treated as a witness." He paused. "By all accounts, it was very difficult for her." Nia said nothing. Lim said, "Nia, it's over." She said, "The trial hasn't happened yet." He said, "No, but he is in custody and the evidence is in front of a clean prosecutorial team, and Haewon's testimony and the financial record and the insurance policies and the recorded interview with Park are all part of a case file that is now sealed and protected." He paused. "The hard part," she said, "the hard part was the 9 months in the chemotherapy chair." Lim was quiet. She said, "I know what you mean. I know." She looked at the garden through the window, the rosemary coming clearer now as the light built. "What happens next?" He said, "Pre-trial hearings will begin in approximately 6 weeks. The defense will file motions. The prosecution will respond. This will take time. A case of this complexity, against a defendant with these resources, will not be quick." He paused. "But the architecture is solid. Yeo Sang-il is thorough and he is clean, and he is angry, which in a prosecutor is a useful combination. She said, "The leak in the original investigation." Lim said, "Internal Affairs is now involved. Oh Ji-hyun has been placed on administrative review pending that investigation. She may be a victim of the leak rather than the source, someone in her office, below her, with access to the timeline. We don't know yet." Nia said, "I hope she didn't know." Lim said, "So do I." She said, "How long before trial?" Lim said, "Best case, 8 months. More likely 12 to 14. She said, "All right." He said, "In the meantime, the civil proceedings against the hospital are advancing. Their legal team has already indicated willingness to negotiate a settlement figure. I believe we can resolve that within 90 days. He paused. "It will be a significant sum. What you do with it is your business, but I want you thinking about what comes after, not just what's happening now." She said, "I've been thinking about it." She had been thinking about it since the stone bench in the garden, in the evenings after chemotherapy, when she had sat with a blanket over her knees and tried to identify what, if any version of the future still existed, on the other side of treatment. She had not been able to see it clearly then, because the disease she never had made the future seem conditional in a way that made detailed planning feel like a form of hubris. But the shape of something had been forming in the months since the conference room, and the pathology documents, and the conversations with Lim and Choi and Baek and Hae-won. A shape that had to do with everything she had been in the decade before Seoul, and everything this city had taken from her, and what you do with the intersection of those two facts when the crisis that produced them is finally, partially, inexactly resolved. She said, "Lim, thank you." He said, "Don't thank me yet. Thank me in 14 months when the verdict comes in." She said, "I'm thanking you now." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Get some rest. I'll call you when the arraignment is scheduled." She set the phone down on the kitchen table. Outside the window, Seoul was fully awake now. The city sound building the way it always built. Layered, purposeful, 10 million people doing 10 million things with the particular forward momentum of a place that had rebuilt itself from ruins within living memory and had never entirely lost the cellular understanding that stopping was more dangerous than moving. Kang Tae-jin was in a holding cell somewhere in that city, the king of an empire that was currently in the first hours of understanding that its architect had been removed. The fear structure collapsing outward from the center, the way structures collapse when the load-bearing element is gone. Not all at once, but in sequence, each piece finding that the thing it had been resting on was no longer there. Nia sat at the table and breathed. Her heart beat its irregular rhythm, the damaged muscle doing the work it had always done, imperfectly, stubbornly, without ceasing. She was still here, and in 6 hours, in a courtroom in central Seoul, Kang Tae-jin's attorney would stand before an arraignment judge and enter a plea. And the machine that Nia had spent months feeding with documents and evidence and her own surviving body would begin the last. The arraignment lasted 40 minutes. Nia was not there. She sat in the villa kitchen with the television off and her phone on the table and a bowl of rice porridge she had made from habit rather than hunger, and she waited. The porridge went cold. The morning light moved across the kitchen floor the way it always moved, slow and indifferent, the kind of light that has no opinion about what happens beneath it. Lim called at 11:43. He said, "Not guilty on all counts, as expected." She said, "As expected." He said, "The defense attorney is a man named Seo Byung-ho. He's handled organized crime defense for 20 years. He's very good, and he knows it." A pause. He filed 3 pretrial motions before the arraignment was finished, challenging the chain of custody on the financial records, challenging the admissibility of Park Min-suk's recorded interview on the grounds that the witness cannot be cross-examined, and requesting a full audit of the investigative process, citing the internal affairs review of the original investigative team. She said, "He's going after the leak." Lim said, "He's going to argue that the entire investigation was procedurally compromised from the beginning and that anything derived from it is tainted. It's a standard move in cases where there's been any internal irregularity, and he has a real irregularity to work with." He paused. Yeo Sung-il anticipated this. The submission pathway we used, Hae-won's testimony going directly to Yeo's division, independent of the compromised channel, was specifically structured to withstand this argument. The financial records came through Choi Yuna's independent investigation before they entered the official record. The timeline is clean. She said, Seo Byung-ho knows that. Lim said, he does, which is why these motions are likely delay tactics more than genuine procedural arguments. He wants time. Time for witnesses to reconsider, for evidence chains to develop questions, for public attention to move elsewhere. He paused. We will not give him time. She said, when does it go to trial? Lim said, Yo is pushing for a date within 10 months. The defense will push back. We will likely land somewhere around 12. She said, all right. He said, are you all right? She said, yes. He said, yeah, Nia. She said, I'm all right, Lim. I promise. She was not entirely all right, and she knew it, and she suspected Lim knew it too, but there was a version of not all right that was functional and forward-moving, and that was where she was. And she had learned over the course of the past year that this version was sufficient. You did not need to be entirely all right to keep moving. You needed to be sufficiently all right. She was that. The pre-trial period stretched across the following months with its own particular texture. Dense with legal correspondence, depositions, motion hearings, the slow and grinding machinery of a case of this complexity working through its procedural requirements. Lim's office became a familiar space, the mismatched chairs and stacked files and the ceiling fan that turned at the same speed regardless of the season. She sat in the mismatched chair across from him twice a week, sometimes more, and they went through documents and strategy and the defense's latest motion and the prosecution's response. And she learned, gradually, the specific rhythms of this kind of fight, the feints and counterfeints, the information that was relevant and the information that was noise, the difference between a development that required response and one that required patience. She was better at patience than she had expected. The hospital settlement was reached in the 4th month. The figure Lim negotiated was larger than he had initially projected. The hospital's board, acutely aware of the public visibility of the criminal case and what it meant for institutional credibility, had decided that a fast and significant settlement served their interests better than a prolonged civil trial. The agreement included a public acknowledgement of the error, a commitment to systemic reforms in the pathology department's chain of custody protocols, and a fund contribution toward medical negligence support in Nia's name. The morning the settlement was signed, Nia sat in a conference room at the hospital, a different conference room than the one where Dr. Han had set 2 documents side by side on the table, but in the same building, on the same floor. And she signed her name 7 times on 7 separate documents while the hospital's legal team sat across from her with the careful, slightly compressed expressions of people who are managing something they would prefer had never happened. She did not feel triumph. She felt tired and precise and certain about what she was going to do with the money. And that certainty was its own kind of fuel. She called her mother that evening and told her the settlement number. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Baby, what are you going to do with all that?" Nia said, "I've been thinking about that for a while." Her mother said, "I figured you had." The idea had been assembling itself since the stone bench in the garden, since the evenings of chemotherapy recovery when she had sat with a blanket over her knees and tried to locate the future in the dark. It had taken the shape of everything she had known before Seoul, the tent cities, the distribution lines, the women who had lost everything and kept moving, filtered through everything Seoul had taught her about the specific ways that systems failed the people who most needed them to work. She was going to build something, not as redemption, not as a monument to what had been done to her, as a function, a thing that worked. She spent 3 months in the planning phase, working with a nonprofit attorney and a foundation specialist and a woman she had known from her humanitarian work years, a South Korean civil society organizer named Park Soo-jin, who had spent 15 years building institutional support structures for women in crisis situations across the country. They met in coffee shops and offices, and once in the villa garden, sitting on the stone bench beside the overgrown rosemary, with documents spread across a folding table that Nia had carried out from the kitchen. The foundation structure was simple: medical assistance, legal support, and emergency housing for women in South Korea facing domestic violence, catastrophic illness, or institutional negligence. The intake process was designed to be navigable by someone who was already overwhelmed, because the women who most needed it would arrive already overwhelmed and would not stay if the system demanded too much of them in the early stages. Park Soo-jin had spent years learning this, and she brought that knowledge into every design decision. They named it the Phoenix Hope Foundation. Nia had not chosen the name for its symbolism, or not primarily. She had chosen it because it was direct, and because the women who came to it would understand immediately what it was offering, and because she had always believed that clarity was a form of respect. The foundation opened its doors 8 months after the hospital settlement, in a building in Mapo-gu, 3 streets from the villa. A converted commercial space with good natural light and a small garden in the back that Nia had insisted on because she knew, from the stone bench and the rosemary and the particular quality of sitting outside in the evenings when the chemotherapy had taken everything else, what it meant to have a place that was outside and quiet and your own. The opening was not a ceremony, it was a morning. The staff arrived, the intake coordinators and the legal support team, and the housing liaison and the 2 nurses who would staff the medical consultation room. Park Soo-jin brought coffee and paper cups from the shop on the corner. Kazuya came, in her clinic scrubs, and stood in the main room with her coffee and looked around at the light and the clean intake desk and the small garden visible through the back window and said, "It's good, Nia." Nia said, "It will be." Kazuya looked at her. Then she said, "I meant it already is." The criminal trial began 13 months after the arrest. Nia was present for every session that the court permitted her to attend as a witness prior to her testimony, and for every session after. She sat in the gallery with Lim to her left and Kazuya to her right on the days Kazuya could arrange coverage at the clinic, and she watched the proceedings with the same focused attention she had brought to everything over the past 2 years. The complete, effortful attention of someone who understands that the details matter, and that looking away is a form of cost. Kang Tae-jin sat at the defense table in a dark suit and looked, as he had always looked, like a man at a slight remove from whatever was happening around him. His face was controlled. His posture was controlled. He had lost weight since the arrest, not dramatically, but visibly, the jaw slightly sharper, the suit sitting differently across his shoulders. He did not look in Nia's direction during the early sessions, a discipline she recognized as deliberate, the same deliberate discipline with which he had moved through rooms as though she were already gone in the last days before she left the penthouse. Seo Byung-ho mounted the defense Lim had predicted: procedural challenges, witness credibility arguments, an extended attempt to introduce doubt about the chain of custody on the financial records. He was precise and well-prepared, and he worked the courtroom with the confidence of a man who had won difficult cases before and expected to win difficult cases again. He ran into the evidence. The financial records were clean. Choi Yuna's methodology was documented and defensible, and she testified for 2 full days in a way that Nia found quietly extraordinary to watch. Compact, specific, unshakable, answering every challenge with the same unhurried precision with which she had placed documents on kitchen tables and kept notebooks in canvas bags. Seo Byung-ho tried 4 different angles on her testimony, and each time she met him at the angle and did not move. Jung-hae Won testified on the 8th day of trial. She had aged since the morning in the Eunpyeong-gu apartment, or perhaps she had simply stopped managing the aging, the effort required to maintain a composed surface having been redirected into something else. She sat in the witness stand in a gray cardigan and answered every question with the flatness of someone who has made a decision and is living on the other side of it. She described the intermediary contact, the scheduling arrangement, the payment, the moment she had understood, gradually, over the weeks following the news of the biopsy error, what the arrangement had actually been for. When Seo asked her on cross-examination why she had not come forward sooner, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I was afraid." Seo said, "Afraid of what specifically?" She said, "Of what happens to people who know things that Kang Tae-jin doesn't want known." Seo objected. The judge sustained it, but it was in the room already, and rooms have a way of retaining things. Nia's own testimony came on the 11th day. She had prepared for it with Lim over 8 sessions, not scripting answers, but stress-testing her account against every possible approach the defense might use. The attempts to suggest she had misread the divorce timeline. The attempts to frame the insurance policies as routine financial planning. The attempts to introduce her psychological state during chemotherapy as a variable that might have affected her perception of events. She and Lim had gone through all of it until the preparation itself was exhausting, and then they had gone through it again. She sat in the witness stand and she was calm. Not performing calm. Actually calm. In the way that comes after the adrenaline of months of fighting has metabolized into something steadier. A body that has been through so much that it has stopped treating the next difficult thing as an emergency and started treating it as the next thing. The prosecutor, Yeo Song-il, led her through the account from the beginning. The diagnosis, the conversation at the marble table, the divorce folder, prepared before she had told Tai-jin about the biopsy, the settlement villa, the months of chemotherapy, the phone calls to Tai-jin's law firm about the medical bills, and the two-sentence response. The morning Dr. Han had asked her to come in, the conference room, the documents on the table. She told it in sequence, in the flat third-person precision that was somehow more devastating than any other register she could have used, and the courtroom was very quiet. Yo asked her to describe the permanent physical consequences of the treatment. She described them. She described them the way she had described everything, plainly, completely, without reaching for emotional effect, because the facts themselves were the effect, and reaching for something beyond them would have diminished them. The cardiac damage, the kidney function that remained below normal baselines, the reproductive consequences, confirmed by 3 separate specialists over the course of the past year. She was 37 years old and she would not have children. She said it in a courtroom in Central Seoul, in English with a Korean interpreter providing simultaneous translation, and the room held it the way rooms hold things that don't have anywhere else to go. When Seo Byung-ho cross-examined her, he was, she would think later, as careful as he could have been. He did not attack her directly. He probed the edges. The timeline of the divorce paperwork, her interpretation of Tai-jin's behavior, the basis for her conclusion that the biopsy switch was intentional rather than exploited after the fact. He was professional and controlled, and he did not shake her account, because her account was built on documents and medical records and the testimony of the people who had verified each piece, and she had lived it. And you cannot successfully argue with a person about what happened to their own body when that person has spent 2 years learning every clinical detail of what happened to their own body. When he finished, she was excused. She walked back to her seat in the gallery and sat down beside Lim, and Kezia, on her other side, put one hand briefly on top of hers and then removed it, which was exactly right, which was Kezia exactly. The verdict came on the 19th day of trial. The judge read the findings in a voice that was precise and without drama. The Korean legal system's particular mode of delivering life-altering information with the same tone you might use to read a utility bill. Guilty on 5 counts: conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, organized criminal activity, medical corruption, and criminal negligence resulting in death. The last count connected to Mrs. Lim, who had died at home without knowing she was sick because her malignant tissue had been assigned to a woman who had been meant to die from it. Life imprisonment. No possibility of parole for 25 years. The gallery made a sound that wasn't quite a sound, an exhale, a collective release of something held. Several people near Nia were crying. She was not. She sat very still with her hands in her lap and listened to the rest of the judge's remarks and felt the verdict settle into her the way large things settle. Not with impact, but with weight, the specific gravity of something that has finally, completely arrived. Tai-jin stood to receive the verdict as required by the court's procedure. She watched him stand, watched his face. He was looking at the judge, not at her, and his face was still controlled. That same composure, that same deliberate remove. But there was something different in it now, something she had not seen there before in all the years she had known him, in all the rooms she had watched him move through. He looked reduced, not broken. She did not think he was a man who broke in the way most people understood breaking. But the architecture that had held his face in place for decades, the architecture of absolute control over his own image, and the image he projected onto the world had developed a fundamental stress fracture. And through the fracture you could see, very briefly, the thing that had always been underneath it. He had built an empire on the premise that he was smarter than the paper trail, smarter than the people around him, smarter than the woman he had married and arranged to kill. He had believed it with the total conviction of a man who had never been seriously tested. She had tested him. She looked at him for the last time as a free man. This man she had once stood beside at a window above the Han River, both of them watching the daylight leave the water, believing in something neither of them could accurately name. And she felt none of the things she had expected to feel. Not triumph, not grief, not the complicated residue of 9 years of a life she had shared with someone who had been planning her death. She felt, mostly, tired. And underneath the tiredness, something quieter and more durable. She looked away. Outside the courtroom, in the wide corridor with its institutional floors and its fluorescent overhead light, journalists waited with cameras and recorders. Lim had prepared her for this. They moved through it efficiently, Lim providing a brief statement on her behalf, Nia saying only that she was grateful for the thoroughness of the prosecution and that she had nothing further to add at this time. The cameras followed them to the building's main exit and then stopped at the glass doors. Outside, on the courthouse steps in the afternoon light, Kazia was waiting. She had not been able to attend the verdict session. A patient emergency at the clinic had kept her through the morning, and she had texted when the verdict was read, a single word in Swahili that Nia had smiled at and not translated for Lim. She came down the steps, and Kazia looked at her face and read it and said, "Life." Nia said, "Life." Kezia put both arms around her and held on, and Nia let her, really let her, in the way she had not been able to let anyone hold on to her in a very long time, and the afternoon light lay across the courthouse steps, and the city made its continuous sound below and beside and around them, indifferent and alive. They stood like that for a moment. Then Kezia said, into her shoulder, "Now what?" Nia said, "The foundation has 17 active cases. The housing coordinator is requesting a budget review by end of month, and Park Soo-jin wants to discuss expanding the legal support program into 2 additional districts." Kezia pulled back and looked at her. Nia said, "So, that." Kezia shook her head slowly, but she was smiling. In the months that followed, the Phoenix Hope Foundation did what Nia had designed it to do, quietly, without ceremony, with the functional efficiency of a thing built by someone who had spent years in places where efficiency was the difference between people receiving help and people not receiving it. Cases came in through the intake desk. Women arrived, sometimes alone, sometimes with children, sometimes so compressed by whatever had happened to them that the first appointment was simply the act of sitting in a room with someone who was not going to add to what had already been done. The intake coordinators had been trained by Kezia and by Park Soo-jin and by Nia's own careful attention to the question of what it felt like to arrive somewhere completely depleted and needed to ask very little of you in the beginning. The small garden in the back became, over those months, a place that people returned to. Nia had not anticipated this specifically. She had included it because she knew what it had meant to her, the stone bench and the rosemary and the outside air, and she had hoped it would mean something to someone else. It did. She saw it happen, on the days she was in the building, in the way certain women migrated toward the garden between appointments, the way they sat on the bench that was not as cold as the marble table had been, in the light that had no agenda. She went to her cardiology appointments. Her heart rate remained irregular and likely always would. The cardiologist monitored it and adjusted her medication twice over the following year and told her, at a checkup 14 months after the verdict, that her numbers had stabilized at a level that was livable, that was manageable, that allowed for a full life with appropriate care. He said it with the particular careful optimism of a cardiologist who knows the limits of what he can offer but has learned to offer it clearly. She said, "Livable is enough." He said, "More than enough for most people." She said, "Yes." She heard about Tae-jin one more time, 4 years and 7 months after the verdict. Lim called on a Tuesday afternoon while she was in a meeting with Park Soo-jin about the 2nd District expansion, and she stepped out into the corridor to take it. He said, "I wanted to tell you before you heard it elsewhere. Kang Tae-jin died this morning, in custody, cardiac arrest. He was 50 years old." She stood in the corridor with the phone against her ear and the sounds of the foundation around her. A typewriter somewhere, a door, someone's voice in the intake room. She said, "Was he alone?" Lim said, "I believe so, yes." She said, "All right." Lim said, "Are you all right?" She said, "Yes. Thank you for calling me yourself." He said, "Of course." She stood in the corridor for a moment after he hung up. The afternoon light came through the window at the end of the hall, the same pale quality of Seoul autumn light that she had noticed on the morning she drove herself home from the hospital 2 years before the verdict, when she had sat in the parking garage for 11 minutes and listened to her own breathing. She thought about him for a moment. Not the man from the courtroom, not the man from the investigation, not the man who had placed a folder on a marble table and explained without hesitation that she was a liability. She thought about the man she had met at a fundraiser in Seoul, the one who had walked into the room a certain way, who had known how she took her tea, who had once driven 4 hours to meet her at an airport because she had sounded tired on the phone. She thought about him for exactly as long as she needed to, and then she let him go. She went back into the meeting. Park Soo-jin looked up when she came in. Nia sat down and picked up the district expansion file and said, "Sorry, where were we?" Park said, "The intake capacity question, whether we staff up before we expand or after." Nia said, "Before. Always before. You staff for the need you expect to have, not the need you currently have." Park said, "That's expensive." Nia said, "Yes." Park looked at her for a moment, the particular look of someone who is checking whether this is the right moment to continue, and Nia gave her the small nod that meant it was, and they went on. The Foundation's 5th anniversary fell on a Thursday in November. It was not marked by a ceremony. Nia had declined the various suggestions for events and celebrations that Park Soo-jin and the staff had periodically raised over the preceding months, not because she was indifferent to what they had built together, but because she had a complicated relationship with the idea of marking things, of pausing to acknowledge what had been accomplished, because pausing had always felt to her like a kind of bet against continuation. But she did go to the rooftop that evening. The building was 6 stories, modest by Seoul standards, and the rooftop was utilitarian: ventilation equipment, a water tank, the structural detritus of a functional building. Someone on staff had put 2 plastic chairs up there, she didn't know when, and a small table with a wooden surface that had weathered badly over the winters, and was now the particular gray of things left outside, long enough to become part of the landscape. She sat in one of the chairs with a cup of tea, the same habit she had always had, and she looked at Seoul. The city spread out below and around her in every direction, the Han River visible to the south, a dark ribbon catching the last of the evening light, the towers and the older buildings and the neighborhoods that spread between them, all of it lit and moving and continuous, 10 million lives running their calculations in the dark. She had been in this city for 15 years. She had come to it from a tent city in Bangladesh carrying a single large suitcase and the particular exhaustion of someone who has given a decade of herself to other people's emergencies and is not sure what comes next. She had built a life here, lost it, rebuilt it into something she had not been able to imagine from the stone bench in the villa garden, something she had not been able to imagine from the chemotherapy chair, something she had not been able to imagine from the parking garage of the tower where she had sat for 11 minutes listening to her own breathing. She had not imagined it because you cannot imagine from inside the worst of things what you will make from the material the worst of things leaves behind. You can only make it, afterward, one decision and one day and one woman sitting across a kitchen table at a time. The city glowed below her. The river moved. The evening was cold and clear, the kind of cold that sharpens everything rather than dulling it, and she could see a long way. She thought about Mrs. Lim, who had died at home in a season she hadn't known was her last. She thought about her often, not with guilt, because the guilt had been misdirected for too long and she had put it down, carefully and deliberately, the way you put down something heavy when you finally understand that carrying it was not the same as honoring the person it represented. She thought about her as a woman who had deserved more than she was given, and she held that thought, and she held the city in her eyes, and she breathed. Kezia came through the rooftop door 20 minutes later with 2 paper cups of coffee from the shop on the corner and sat in the other plastic chair without ceremony, the way she had always done things. She handed Nia one of the cups. Nia took it. They sat there for a while without talking. The city moved below them, indifferent and alive, doing what cities do. After a while, Kezia said, 233. Nia said, Kezia said, cases this year. I asked Soo-jin before I came up. Nia said, 241. Kezia said, she said 233. Nia said, 8 more came in this week. Kazia looked at her. Then she shook her head slowly, the same slow head shake as on the courthouse steps, and she was smiling again. Nia looked at the river. The last of the evening light was leaving the water, the same way it had left the water from the penthouse window on evenings she could no longer access without a deliberate act of memory, and she watched it go, and it was simply light leaving water. And then the water was dark, and the city was still there, and so was she. The tea was warm in her hands. She drank it.